Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ellen Weiss. I'm the president of the board of FIJ. Today in our webinar, we're going to focus on how to avoid or challenge something that can be a super big barrier to investigative reporting. What do you do when local or state or federal authorities want to charge you crazy high fees for obtaining open records? We have an incredible expert who will share her strategies and practical tips for working with officials to lower those fees and to make it possible to get all those vital documents and all that data. But before we get into that, I want to spend a few minutes talking about FIJ grants and how you can be awarded up to $10,000 and now even more potentially to support your investigation. At FIJ, our mission is really simple. We want to support independent journalists to produce high quality, unbiased investigative stories with impact. In other words, we want to give you money to do this work. And hey, if anyone who's in this webinar has received an FIJ grant, just let us know, what type, when did you get it, what did you do with it? Just toss it into the comments section. That would be really great. I'm going to switch to sharing my screen for a minute just to go over some basics about our grants. So give me one sec. Share. All right, my screen is always awesome. Yeah, okay, so let's begin with what kind of funding does FIJ provide? We basically have four grants now. We have regular grants, which are up to $10,000. And that's kind of once you have a story idea, you can pitch it to us, any topic, any type of investigation. We have seed grants, and those are grants for like that early reporting that you need to do before you know if you have a story. Maybe you have to get a document to figure out or some data to kind of prove your theory. Maybe you have to do a single interview, but that means travel. So this is the preliminary reporting, and a lot of times what we hope for, well, we always hope for that the seed grant will lead to a regular grant. We also give follow-up grants. We know that once you're onto a good story, you really don't want to stop. And so there might be a great follow-up that you want to do. And we're happy to, support that follow-up reporting as well. And just recently, we absorbed the Alicia Patterson Fellowships. And so now we have another category. This is for in-depth reporting, really from probably slightly more experienced reporters. We award up to $20,000 for 6 months of reporting and up to $40,000 to spend a year on a project. So usually these are multi-part projects. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then in August, we're going to have a whole webinar just on how to apply for the Alicia Patterson Fellowships. What are we looking for in an application? Basically, think of it as like the pitch you're going to make to an editor, right? So why is this an investigative journalism project, right? What are you trying to uncover that hasn't been uncovered before? We know that most topics have been reported on. So how are you going to advance what we know already about that topic? And, where's the accountability angle, right? What are your initial findings? Like, we need to know that it's more than a hunch, right? So share some of the information that you have to let us know that, oh yeah, you're onto something. We can see, where this is going. You've kind of taken it and established, the premise. Everything is confidential, so you don't have to worry about it leaking out. We're looking for your plan. Now that you have some findings, how are you going to go about to fully report out the story? Like, what's your roadmap? Again, what will you uncover that's new? We want to know what exists already. So don't worry if stories have been done on the topic. Again, how are you going to push it forward? And then a little bit about you. Like, why are you in a good position to do this work? Maybe it's experience, maybe it's location, maybe it's even a personal story. So those are regular grants, right? Who's eligible? Most of our grants go to freelancers, but we also award them to nonprofit outlets and even to occasionally to for-profit outlets. Um, in terms of formats, we pretty much accept any kind of format, right? Print, digital, video, audio, photojournalism, books. And so there are no limitations, again, as long as it's an investigative story. We get a lot of questions about are international stories eligible? And some are, right? They don't need to come from a US-based reporter. That's inaccurate. So I'll correct my own slide. You don't have to be based in the US, but you do have to have a strong US angle, right? There has to somehow involve an American citizen or business, some government angle. And you also need to have an outlet in the US that will publish it. It doesn't have to be exclusive to that outlet. Let's say you're based in Peru. It's okay if you have a Peruvian outlet as long as you have an outlet based in the US. Again, it's for seed grant. That's up to $2,500. It's the preliminary reporting. Again, it's for investigative stories, not explanatory reporting, but investigative stories. These grants, again, usually cover some preliminary reporting. Maybe you need open records, initial reporting trips. It can also cover your reporting time, right? This application really just asks for an overview, like a little bit of an explanation about why you think this is a story, um, where, what you need the money for. What you don't need are initial findings. And unlike the regular grants, you don't need a letter of commitment. You just sort of need a good reason to believe that there's a story. What expenses do we cover? Basically travel, records fees, data collection, reporting time. A lot of people have asked, hey, can I put money in for the time I spend? Absolutely. And that's a big difference with FIJ grants. We understand that investigative reporting is a big commitment of time. And if you need to, pay yourself, this grant can help you with that. What we won't support in terms of your budget and the grant, renting office space, buying equipment. We might support renting equipment and how you distribute and promote it. Those are sort of things that you need to cover. There's a template, and all of this is being recorded, so you don't have to scribble away at taking notes. You're gonna get this, but there's a template on the FIJ website that'll give you an example of what a budget looks like. Deadlines coming up. September 14th for both regular grants and seed grants. And then the Alicia Patterson grants are October 1st. There's a lot of information on the FIJ website. We actually did a webinar in April about what makes a good regular grant application. A lot of good information there. You can email us. And so hopefully this webinar and other webinars we have done will really help you in that process. So now we can get on to our guest for the day. Like I said, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk with our guest, and mostly, though, we hope that you'll be populating either the chat or the questions with things you want to ask her whenever they come up, right? You don't have to wait for the end of our conversation. And as I said, we're recording this webinar, so if you don't want to take notes, don't worry about it. You're safe. So for a lot of investigative reporting, it's really critical to obtain records, right? From local, state, or federal officials. Maybe it's data, maybe it's incident reports. A lot of requests for body cam footage these days, evidence, for investigations. In fact, at FIJ, we actually did an analysis of how important records requests are in our grant proposals. And we found that 84% of seed grant proposals include money for records. And in most of these proposals, the records were like over a quarter of the total grant budget. For regular grants, 67% of the proposals included requests for records. funds to pay for records. Like sometimes the entire request that we get is for records fees. And this is especially true of some of the costlier things like body cam footage, large data sets that officials have to review manually. A grant we made for case records of police shootings over a 20-year span isn't a good example. So we have seen firsthand that journalists need funding in order to get records, and we also provide our grantees with help to get records, including how to appeal for after denials, with a partnership that we have with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. High fees for open records requests is just a real barrier sometimes to public access. In theory, these records are supposed to be public. In practice, the agencies can charge enough for search, review, redaction, copying, that journalists and ordinary people are just priced out before they even get the information. I mean, we're talking sometimes up to hundreds of thousands of dollars in the most extreme cases. And of course, in the end, that turns transparency into a paywall, right? Instead of access depending on the public's right to know, it depends on whether the reporter has the time or the money or the persistence, even to keep pushing. And so as a result, important stories can stay hidden. Accountability gets weaker, and people who have the fewest resources are often the least able to see what the government is doing. And I'd be really interested if anybody has hit that wall when requesting records. Like, have you ever had to just kind of like walk away from a story? Just, drop it in the chat. Because fees can be a way to discourage requests altogether. So, the core issue is simple. Open records laws only work when records are actually reachable. If the fees are too high, access exists on paper, but not in practice. There are a lot of resources out there on records requests, generally on how to file requests. In particular, like I said, our partners at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press have a really great guide and provide assistance directly to reporters. And again, we'll include a link in their guide and the reporter hotline on a tip sheet that we have. Um, but that's why we want to focus on this question of how to negotiate fees, right? Because the first number you get and the first response you get doesn't have to be the final one. And our expert guest today, Kimbrielle Kelly, is really like a superhero in the world of investigative reporting, documents, data, and fee reduction strategy. In addition to being the vice president of the FIJ board, Kimbrielle is the editor-in-chief of Chicago Public Media. She's a veteran investigative editor. She's a reporter who's overseen multiple award-winning projects in some of the nation's largest newsrooms. When she was at the Los Angeles Times, she edited the immigration coverage that led to the Bureau's first Pulitzer Prize in 17 years. Before that, she was an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, where she was part of the team that won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting for their series Fatal Force. That's the series that uncovered the FBI's crazy undercounting of fatal officer-involved shootings. I could go on, but for our purposes today, what you really want to know is that Kimbrielle has filed more than 200 FOIAs and received more than 10,000 pages of documents and data. She knows a lot about getting records and getting them at the best possible price, and how to work with records keepers to keep what you need, even, or I should say, to get what you need, even when they first say no. So, Kimbrielle, welcome.
Thank
Let me
you.
start by saying, when it comes to getting fees waived, like, when should a reporter first start thinking about that, about the costs and how to keep them as low as possible? What's the starting point for you?
That's a very smart question. I think that each reporter needs to actually have their own personal ethos. Um, and that means most reporters go in thinking like, oh, I want this record, and that's enough. But I think having a personal ethos helps guide every public records requests. So for me, mine is something like, I'm going to get the records. So it creates this positive momentum and a strategy that I have for all public records requests, not just one. And so that's my North Star that guides me. So for my ethos being, I'm going to get the records. Now, do I think I'm going to get the records all the time? No. But if I start with that vantage point, I'm thinking differently. I'm thinking about strategy. I'm thinking about outcome. I'm thinking about pivoting more often when I hit a brick wall. So if I hear a no, it's a no for now. I haven't developed the right strategy and then I'll pivot to something else. So I think for most reporters, instead of thinking about just the singular FOIA, dial it back a little bit and focus on what is my overall strategy? Maybe for some of you, it's I want to make sure to get it within 3 months. A magazine that I used to work for, we had a 95-day production cycle in Chicago. And so you knew that you had to have your public records within that period of time. So that helps you think through, the time years you're asking for, how much the volume of records. And so I would say start there. The second thing I would say is know your organizations. Oh, go ahead, Ellen. You look like you had a follow-up question there.
No, 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 no. I love that. Like I love you start with like the mindset, and the mindset is like, I'm gonna get these records. I'm in this. Let's go. So
Let's go.
continue.
If the answer is yes, what is the path? Right? So the second thing, and this is very important as well, especially if you could say, yes, I know the path. You need to know your organization's ethos. And so for many people who are applying for FIJ grants, you may be freelancers. And so think about the ethos of the organization you're going to be partnering with, or the fact that you're going to be a freelancer. And so perhaps for freelancers, if you're working for the Washington Post, you're highly unlikely to go to litigation, right? So I know right off the bat, if my personal ethos is yes, that whatever constraints I have filing my public records, it's not going to go to litigation, probably. Litigation is costly. It takes a lot of time. And by the time it goes through the courts, even if you get a successful ruling through the federal courts in a year or 2 years, you've probably moved on to a different project, to a different organization. And even when you get a successful ruling, and I've had this happen before, the government may start releasing your records on a rolling basis. And so you're actually not getting all the records right away. It could take years. So off the bat, I generally try to stay out of court that way. But I do want to be in court for things that do matter. So no, if you're working with an organization and you know that they're not going to provide you with legal resources, like just keep that in mind as you're coming up with your strategy.
That's great. I think one other thing that you might subscribe to is even before you get into the thought of requests is to see what's already out there, right? See what's already in the public. There's Google Advanced Search, there's agency websites, open data portals, court record systems. I think especially if you're a freelancer, doing that initial search to figure out what could save you a lot of time. I know at FIJ, we sometimes see requests for information and we're like, we should let them know that such and such has that information and they don't need to wait for it. So I would just add, like, even before you think about it, like jump in and see what's out there already.
Absolutely. And I would just add that is probably one of most of us, I think, have submitted public records requests on the FIJ board. And so when we're reviewing, we are actually looking to proposals and we're saying, hey, is this out there? We're doing our own searches. And if we find something, and that happens pretty regularly where we're like, hey, this source already exists, you should mind that could save you thousands if not hundreds of thousands of dollars and time and frustration.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about some of the ways that a records request can balloon. Like you talked about even knowing like you may go in and you have a budget and it seems manageable and then it just blows up and it becomes impossible. Like what, again, what would be the strategy for trying to curtail that kind of response?
I've been doing public records ever since I was in my early 20s, probably 22 years old, and I'm in my 50s now. So I have a cheat sheet, which you all will get the benefit of that in the tip sheets afterwards. So I've seen consistent patterns time and time again, mostly because of mistakes that I've made. And so there are probably three big ones that you should take notes on. One is format. The second is the years you're asking for, and the third is the details to narrow the actual request. So I'll just walk through each of those quickly. The format is critical. Most reporters don't specify what format they have, or they specify a format that's going to be expensive. So if you look at some of your old public records requests, some folks are asking for things like, I want correspondences. Well, what are correspondences? To a federal agency or a local government agency, that's you want a document. So when you're saying you want a paper document, you're already going to have a huge dollar amount probably for copy fees. You're probably going to have an estimate for labor. And so they'll take the salary of an employee who might be, earning $50, $60 an hour. And they'll say, oh, okay, well, how long will it take this person to photocopy one page? And then if you're asking for 2,000 pages, they'll just multiply that salary times the 2,000 pages. And then you're surprised when you get a bill for $20,000 versus if you had just asked for that record in a digital format and they're like, oh, that's a $2 CD. So that's one quick and dirty way. Know how the records are kept and know how you can request them. So I always try to get digital. Second is the years that you're requesting. For most investigations, like ideally, we'd love to have 20 years. It makes for great trend stories to show patterns. The reality of the fact is data systems have changed dramatically over the years. And so how things are classified over a 20-year period. I mean, think about technology 20 years ago and think about it today. So you're often asking an IT or technology person to cobble together for your 20-year data set request 20 like multiple different systems that may not be aligned, that may not exist the same way 20 years ago. Also, you're asking and assuming, probably incorrectly, that the columns or the data that you're requesting has been kept the same over 20 years. A good example that I'd like to point to is the census data. There was a period of time where you can look at the census data and Hispanics were not included as Hispanics. It was included like Black, white, Hispanic. I think this was back in the 60s or 70s. Well, if you requested the data that way, it was separate from Black and white. Today, Hispanic is a separate category that is layered on top of Black and white because you can be Hispanic and Black and you can be Hispanic and white. So today's categorization is much more nuanced, but it's different. So if you're doing a 20-year, 40-year, retrospective, you might analyze the data incorrectly. So while I would love to say 20 years, request the data, it's going to be costly and expensive. Most of the 20-year data is also kept in hard copy files. They are not digital. A lot of government agencies have digitized them. So what you're more likely to find is that an agency has 10 years worth of hard copy data that they're going to charge you for. And then they have 10 years worth of digital data that's going to be probably more in line with how the organization is chronicling or labeling data, and it's going to be easier to access. And the third is narrowing the request. A perfect example is like police records. A lot of the FIJ requests are about policing. And so people say, well, if I just get the file of this bad officer, well, each file for most officers in general costs about $300 to $500. So if you're looking to do an analysis of like 200 officers, that's going to be expensive. And if you're a freelancer looking for one file, $300 to $500, you're doing a fishing expedition hoping that you find something. What's better is asking either for a disciplinary investigation on each of those officers because it's generally a 5 to 10 page document that will cost you 5 to 10 cents for copying, or it might be free if you ask for it digitally. Even better is refining the request. So if I'm not asking for the full officer jacket, I'm asking for all the outcomes of the investigative file because each investigation is just going to have an outcome. If you're looking at somebody's, if you're really pressed for money, I would look for sustained allegations. So where the police department, internal affairs investigated and found that something was wrong. Because then if the person had been investigated 40 times, I already know that because I've asked them. I could FOIA saying, well, how many times have they been investigated? I don't need the files on it. That's a count. But if I pull sustained investigations, there might be two, and they're going to be 10 pages. So I'll ask for the outcome of the investigation, and then I'll ask for the exhibit list that went along with it. Why? Because the exhibit list is going to have a list of all the documents, if it's 20 or 40 documents that were reviewed as part of that investigation. And then I highlight the 3, 4, or 5 things that I want. If I see that there are audio recordings of the officer statements, if I see that there are transcripts of witness testimonies, I'll request the actual things that I want to reduce my costs rather than just wholesale asking for everything.
That's great. And someone asked, and I think what I'm hearing you say is obviously electronic records is definitely, the way to go. But how do you know how records are kept prior to asking? Like, is that something that you can find out before
Yeah.
you begin your search? Great.
I
Share that
love,
wisdom.
love this question. And I'll start with an example with a former reporter that I had. They said that there was this one particular federal agency. I had suggested that the reporter get send a FOIA off to this federal agency, and they said this agency was known for not responding to FOIA requests. I said, that's not true. And they said, yes, it is. I said, no, I know that's not true. So I asked the person to FOIA for 1 month, FOIA the agency for how many responsive records they released for the 1 month. And the person contacted them back immediately and said, asked our reporter, can you narrow the request? And the reporter's like, I don't understand why. They're like, oh, because we responded to 2,000 requests or something like that this month. So it just showed the point that these agencies are responding. It's how you craft a successful request. And that's part of my ethos also. I want a yes based off of a successful request. The problem that probably a vast majority of people submit is they are just submitting bad requests. So, what does refinement look like to answer your question? It's taking a look at so if I know that there's like a database or something that I want, but I don't know how the records are kept, I tell reporters report for your FOIA as if you're reporting for a daily story. So if I assigned you a daily story for tomorrow and I said you what you're going to do because you're all great reporters, you're going to finish the story by 6 p.m. It's going to be published. So if my story to you was find your public records custodian's cell phone number and name, you're going to do that by 6 p.m. That is the biggest mistake that people make. They send FOIA requests to just an unknown or anonymous email and then hope that they get the request. That's the problem. You don't even know who you're talking to. You're not building a relationship. The goal of your FOIA is to build strategic relationships with people, have them their cell phone number, text the person to check on updates, and stay on top of those requests. When you do that, you want to get this person on the phone. They don't want you to waste their time, and you don't want to waste their time. So you ask them, you're like, hey, and I know we're all trained to not tell people what we're looking for. The public records custodian doesn't really care. They just want to be able to check this off their list. So tell them, I'm looking to find out the number of officers who've been disciplined about X, but I'm not sure exactly how that those records are kept that would actually get me to that answer. What is the easiest way to go about that? I included this in a book that's about public records. I forgot the name of it. It'll come to me. But it's a really great book about FOIA. And I included that as one of my tips. I called the internal affairs officer and I was like, how do you keep your data? How do you keep the data? And what is the exact name of the system? And then I would type it. And then I said, what are the exact names of the files? Once you have that, there it becomes very difficult to deny your request because you know the name of the system, you know the name of the file, and you know the department that has it. And so you're increasing your likelihood for success. And that's the goal. Is like I make this almost like a game. How do I increase my likelihood of success before I even file the FOIA?
That's great. That's awesome advice. We have another question. When asking for disciplinary investigations on officers, particularly federal officers, have you encountered denials citing privacy concerns? And if so, how have you navigated them?
Sure. I mean, it kind of depends. So for privacy concerns, it depends what you're looking for, right? Um, you should talk to the custodian and ask, well, what is considered the privacy concern? Um, because there's probably something specific they have in mind. And there could be a specific record that actually has something that is a privacy concern. Like the record you're asking for may have the officer's home address, and you're never going to get that, right? So, but if you can talk to the public records custodian and figure out what the actual issue is, the specific issue, not vaguely, specific issue, then you would say, oh, I totally get that. Can you just give me the records and redact that address? And they'd probably say, oh, okay, sure, fine, whatever. So the goal is, or maybe they'd say no, the goal is to identify what the actual problem is and get somebody to articulate that from the federal government. I had that happen with the federal agency before, and they said that a record was PII. And it was a government oversight agency. And they said that I couldn't get the records because it was a quasi it was Fannie Mae, and they said it was a quasi government agency and it was PII. Once I had that drill down conversation, I said, I think you have these records. They said, no, I don't. I actually FOIA the emails during the period that they were auditing um, to show that they actually just that they had the records. And I didn't get the records in the emails. What I got was them talking to the agency saying that they were delinquent and sending them the records and then thanking them when they received the records, which showed me that they had the presence of the information, which the government had it. Once we established that, I was able to say, well, what in that is public? They said, well, people's social security numbers, and it's in this column. And I said, okay, great. I will take the data and you can remove the people's social security numbers and addresses, which I didn't want anyway. Even if I did need something for census tract data analysis for the addresses, I might ask that they anonymize it some way by giving me a geolocated, street address or something like that. So I always try to find a plan B or C or D to get the records anyway. But really, you have to identify where the what is their concern for that personal information first. If you don't know what that is, you have nothing to come up with a plan B, C, D.
Yeah, that sounds great. Just a couple other questions. If you suspect that there might be information in email correspondence between inspectors at a state agency and oil and gas operators regarding well cleanup operations, how do you narrow down the request?
So, again, you need to find people. You need to find a specific person whose email you want so that you're not going on a fishing expedition and asking for all the stuff for well requests. So there's two things that you can do. Well, there's more than two, but two that quickly come to mind. Identify a person, not 10 different people, but one specific person who you think would have all the records. And I'll give you an example of that. The second thing is come up with a list. It sounds like you're an expert in a certain area, this gas and well person. So you probably know the language that is used around that. So I might come up with, 10 different phrases and then submit a public records request saying, I want you to query your database. And you would have already talked to the public records custodian to know the name of the main database that agency works out of. I want you to query this database or query your emails for any email that has these 10 words in it. And I want the result, my FOIA request, to be an Excel file with the email to line, from line, subject line, and date. Because they're not producing the records, they're producing a log of the records. That way, you actually go through, you're going to get like a 20, 30-page document and say for a year, right? Don't pick 10 years, pick like 3 months or 6 months. Your goal is to identify who is the person talking about this thing and what are the names of the documents that they're using and what are the subject lines. Once you get that, and I've done this with police officers as well, then I highlight all the emails I actually want. I've already learned the names of the people who are doing the main talking. I've already learned who the bosses are. So then I'll send a second request asking for, David Brown. David Brown's emails during a specific period with the specific names. Then I'll ask for that log. And I'll say, but only if I'm trying to narrow it down. If they ask me to narrow it, I said, okay, well, only include the logs of emails that had attachments. Why? Because that means they're trading information. And that information, I want the name of those attachments so that I can then turn around, send another request specifically asking for those attachments, which are already produced as a PDF, which means they're not going to cost me any money. They're not going to give me a denial over unduly burdensome, and I can make a request to put it on the simple track because I'm only asking for one, two, or three documents.
That's great. There's another question, and it sort of gets at something I was wondering as well, which is you are describing a really kind of neutral, helpful FOIA officer, right? Somebody, though, says that they learned that the FOIA officer and the press office of the organization were kind of collaborating, and the press team was sort of influencing if and how requests were processed. Is that more common, or is the sort of person that you're describing, or is it just you try and you'll never know?
You're always going to have every now and then press spokesperson who's doing damage control, right? They have a different role. I find that in local offices, like cities, like big cities, small towns, medium-sized towns may not have like a spokesperson per se, but I find it in that happened to me in like Memphis before, and they were really concerned about the image, and the mayor was up for re-election. Especially during election time, you'll get more of that intervention to try to like protect somebody's image. Yes, I've dealt with it. I really don't pay it much mind. I just know that it's going to occur. You just have to have firm boundaries. No, again, you probably should create an ethos around that, which is for me, I try to keep the spokesperson out of it. My ethos is that the spokesperson has a role, and that role is to shape what the conversation is from the mayor's office or whoever's office. The public records custodian's role is to answer my questions and return, based off of the law, responsive records. So when I get a call from a spokesperson, which has happened all the time. And they're like, oh, I understand you submitted this public records request. And I was like, yeah, I submitted it. And they said, oh, can you tell me more about this story? And I would say, oh, I'm curious about your interest, because I hadn't reached out to the mayor's office. So you just really have to have your clear boundary, like you don't have a role in this. And well, yeah, I'm just kind of curious because and Philadelphia does this too. And they're like, well, because we really communicate well with one another. I was like, oh, okay, that's great. Well, you know what? Sure. I'm in the data gathering process right now for a story that I'm working on. As you probably already assumed, because I saw you on my LinkedIn, that I'm an investigative reporter. So I am finding out what the data is so that I can do some reporting. But at which point I'm ready to call the mayor's office in the event that I need them for a comment, that I am more than happy to reach out to you.
And mic drop.
You're basically just saying this is not your role at the
Yeah,
time, but you're not being an a-hole. You're just like, hey, at the moment that I actually realize if I need to talk to you, I will absolutely call you. So you're not being negative.
yeah,
You're not icing them out of the process. You're just basically creating their lane and having them stay in it.
yeah. You mentioned something there about the law, and so I'm really curious, like, what do reporters need to know about how much leverage they have to narrow the scope, to ask for digital formats, to negotiate with agencies, like what's our power?
We have state law on our side. We have federal law on our side. I don't know how much more you need than that. And we have litigation and favorable rulings. What we don't have is enough reporters who are actually becoming familiar enough with the law to use it to their advantage. Sorry, but most of you, if I had to see a show of hands, I would say how many of you have actually read the Freedom of Information Act? I'm guessing there would probably be no hands raised right now, maybe one, sort of. And if I said, have you read your state FOIA law? Most people would not raise their hands. So how can you go in and demand something based off the law that you are unfamiliar with? Now, do I expect everybody to be an attorney? No, I'm not an attorney. But what I do expect is if you plan on requesting anything from a government agency, federal or local, that you would have gone to the website where the law is and hit Control F, Control Find, whatever it is, and typed in the basic word of the thing you're looking for, like law enforcement files or environment, to see what in the law it says about environment. And if it says that the government must disclose any governmental records around environment except for when it deals with trade, awesome. Now I've been empowered to know how the law is on my side. That means that I might copy that clause from the law and put it in my FOIA to send to show one, I've read the law, I'm familiar, and two, I know what I'm entitled to. So knowing the law, I didn't have to read the whole thing. I just control F. That took like 20 seconds, but I used that to strengthen my FOIA requests, especially if I'm a freelancer. It shows that you're familiar and that you're not going to be taken advantage. It does send a message to the person who's receiving that public records request. They kind of want you out of the way and give you what you want. They know that it's going to be a battle to fight you because you're already citing the law, but it also gets you familiar with what you legally can have access to.
Yeah, so knowing the law means you can use the law, and when you cite the law, it makes a big difference.
Absolutely.
Um,
And it's the difference between a request. I had somebody to tell me this a long time ago, and it's so powerful. I've been using it for the last 10 years that they're like, a FOIA, they said it's not really a request. They said we need to stop using the word request. It's a law. So it's like, I'm not asking you for something, I am telling you what the law says I'm entitled to. And I think that's a much more powerful way of
Great way
looking
to
at it.
frame it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's wonderful. Two quick questions. One is, in your ethos, do you have a maximum amount you're mentally prepared to pay for a request, or are you always kind of endeavoring it to get to $0? And your personal ethos, Kimberly,
Being
please share
right.
with us.
Yes, I do. So my ethos, there's two parts. One, yes, you're correct. My goal is to always get it to zero. Um, and I'm going to tell you why. This is the state law and the federal law. These records already exist. What is happening is you have asked that they be handed over to you. Why should there be a huge fee associated to that if it's already kept digitally and everything is now? I find that. So my ethos is I should be getting stuff for free. I can understand if somebody's like, oh, but we have to download it to a CD and we paid the cost of the CD. Great. I'll pay the $2 for the CD. I totally get that. But to replicate, you're not asking to replicate new records. That's one thing. Is there a cost that a maximum? Yes, it's super low. It's like $500. But even when I was at the Washington Post, it was still $500. It was like the joke of my coworkers because they knew when they worked on projects with me, even though we worked at the Post, it's like I'm still not going to pay for it because my ethos was the same. The public has already paid with their tax dollars for these records. It's my job to be able to show what's happening with it.
That's great. So, is there a different strategy for a freelancer versus, say, either a nonprofit news outlet? You worked at the Washington Post. About 70% of FIJ grantees are freelancers. And, we often hear from some of them that they kind of struggle for credibility with records administrators. So how can a freelancer negotiate fees when they're sort of already being treated less seriously? Like what tips do you have?
I think Um, there's a couple of things. I think, yes, I think freelancers don't necessarily have the name of an organization attached to them, so that could hurt him. I have never had a public records custodian who says that, but it's just kind of the feeling that you get. If you have also, so I would say that helps. Having a large organization also helps because a place like the Washington Post, there is a concern that you'll sue for the records or that you'll bring some sort of litigation against the government. So I believe that there is that fear that's there also when it comes to that. So keep those things in mind. I find it that like regular ordinary citizens have or not even citizens, just people who live here and file requests, that they also have a hard time. So I think that freelancers have almost the same issue that that just the regular general public does have. So I think that keep that in mind. So partnering, thinking about your costs early, understanding that your time frame might take a little bit longer in order to get the request. So build in that time. One of the things we see in the FIJ requests is like people saying that they're going to get the requests for like in 3 months or something. And if it's a federal government, I'm like, there's no way you're getting this in 3 months. And so I think having more realistic expectations about what you can get as a freelancer, elongating the time frame, but really doing your due diligence and having strategy ahead of time to plan out these things. A lot of reporters don't think enough about strategy going into the FOIA process. And I think you really need to do it, especially if you're a freelancer. How you can improve your odds. You mentioned it earlier, and I believe in this. Like, look for the public records that are already on the internet. If you do a Google advanced search and you look for things that are like PFDs or Excel files, I change it to that to see what's already existing. And you might say, oh, well, it only has, 8 years worth of data. I want 10. Well, that's a start. Find the agency that released the 8 years of data and then just ask for the additional 2 years. FOIA your agency ahead of time for the last year, whether it's local or federal, and ask for what responsive records that they've released. I would ask for the FOIA requests of any FOIA that they release responsive records to in the last year. What you're learning is how a successful FOIA is crafted. So you're learning it as language, what to use that got them a successful result. Then you apply that kind of language in your own requests. Have honest conversations with the FOIA officer. I think reporters hold back too much. The reality is you don't know exactly what your story is. So when they're saying like, well, what are you getting at? You're like, I'm trying to figure that out. That's why I'm filing a FOIA. And I think that will go a long way. But what they're trying to do is get you to get a request that's successful. They're trying to get you to narrow the time period or to narrow it down to a simple subject. But then also use legal language. If I wrote a letter saying I want this kind of document, I may not be taken seriously. But if I wrote a letter, and as a freelancer, you'll have to do this, that sounds very legalese, you're probably more likely to get a response in that same manner. And also just don't go fishing. Like, I think, I want all correspondences. When I see all, you'll see if the same exercise looking for the successful request, if you did it the opposite, looking for all the requests that were rejected, you'll probably get a lot of language like, I want all of this and all of that. And the response is probably overly burdensome. So I think that those are the key things that you can do to kind of make your case as a freelancer to either partner or either have stronger legal language and specific details of your request to show that you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's great advice. Another question. In the last couple of years, I've experienced federal agencies responding to FOIA requests with their own request for permission from a person mentioned in the docs, which would be very hard to come by. Have you gotten these responses and how do you deal with them? So they're asking you for information before, or I guess they're telling you they have to get permission from somebody before they can respond.
Yeah, I had that happen a couple of times. I think one was in Minneapolis for like a police officer who was involved in like a shooting or something like that, a fatal. And then they're like, well, we have to notify them because it's a disciplinary record. And I think it was through the state police or something like that. And so the thing that it happens. And, I couldn't do anything to control it. But again, it's the law. It wasn't like I was going to be publishing. I think the issue was the officer's address. And so you just do what you can to just say, I'm not looking to publish PII, the officer's address, which is usually the case for something like that. Address the issue. If it's personally identifiable information, just tell them you don't want that.
Yeah, great. What happens when you hit the wall, right? You're trying to escalate your appeal on the fees, but it also means like your project's getting delayed, you're delaying the records. Like, how do you balance all of that? You mentioned that, one newsroom you had a 95-day deadline, but you're 50 days in and you're not getting much traction. What do you do?
I pivot. So I always have, public records requests are a strategy, like A to Z. Most people see it as a binary, which is like I make a request, I get the request. I think most people fail when they have that strategy. Mine is a multi-pronged. The more points of contact you have with your public records custodian or agency, if I have 10 points of contact, and points of contact could be a telephone call, a text message, checking in on my request every week, an email, anything, even just like, they told me over the phone that they had a dog. And I said, oh, how's your dog, Fifi? Every point of contact, I track it because my view is that if I increase, as part of my ethos, I increase my chances of success with increased points of contact. You're building a relationship. And so some of the things that I do is I start out with the strategy from the beginning. So if I have that and I have my points of contact, I know that I'm increasing my chances of a yes. So try different strategies and pivot as quickly as you can. You want to really log your progress week to week. So, like FOIA Fridays is something that reporters do. And I keep an Excel file that's in reverse order. So every time I check on a FOIA, I put my date, 6/24, text message public records custodian and ask any update. So you can see, and I try not to let any week go by where I haven't contacted somebody. That way, when you see that you haven't gotten a response over 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then you have to pivot to plan B. Then you have to pivot to plan C. You may need to start picking up the phone more often. So when I have to start picking up the phone, I play a little game with myself and I say, okay, I'm going to call this person 3 times or 4 times today if I'm really on a deadline and I need to pivot quickly. I'll say I'll call them first thing in the morning to leave a voicemail message. Then I'll call back again in an hour to see if they pick up the phone. If they don't call me back by lunch, then I'm going to keep calling every hour on the hour until they pick up. At the end of the day, I'm going to call the receptionist to see if they're even in the office and if somebody can find them. And so the goal is by the time they're going to see your number keeps coming up, they're eventually going to talk to you and you increase your chance of success. 2 cases in which I've had problems and they were stiff fees. I had $500,000. I think one was Detroit and then the other one I think was Savannah. They gave me the $500,000 estimate and I suggest that your plan B is, well, I'm not going to pay $500,000, even though I was at the Washington Post. And so I said, okay, well, give me an invoice of where the fees, I haven't agreed to pay for them. What are the costs? Like, what are the labor fees? What are the copy fees? Then you can see what you can cut. And so what I ultimately ended up finding out was for Detroit, it's different than Savannah. So Detroit, 10, I think it was 10 years were digital and 10 years were print. And so the print cost was like literally the example I gave earlier about the cost of a clerk to pull all these hard copy records and make copies. And I said, oh, great, I'll just take the 10 years of digital. And then they're like, oh, great, then it's $2 for the CD fee. And I'm pretty certain I ended up not even having to pay that because they sent it to me. Yeah, I don't think we ended up paying that. Savannah was different. They had sent me homicide data and it's homicide data. And I was fact checking it early because you always want, when you get the records, to fact check it real quick just to make sure it's the right records that you have. And I was doing this fact check and I was finding out these people were alive. And I was like, wait, this is supposed to be a database of homicides. It turns out that they put all victims in there, both the ones who had survived and the ones who were homicides. Obviously, that would have been a huge mistake if we had just taken that data at face value. So I said, how do I aggregate this out? They said, we have no way of doing it because they had gotten hit by some like bug in Georgia and all their technology was like fried and they were working to fix it. And so they actually told me there was a local like funeral home that kept all of the obituaries. They said that it would be better and I would get it for free if I just took the names from the database that they had sent me and looked them up in the funeral home database to figure out who had died. And so that's essentially what I did.
Wow. Sometimes you see that like a suggestion for when you file your FOIA request is to make the case that you're doing this in the public interest, to include like your past work, things like that. How important is it for a reporter to sort of make that case for themselves? Is that something that you would put like high, middle, low priority?
You know, maybe high priority for some. It hasn't been for me in my career, shockingly. And the times I've done it, it hasn't really served me well to to put anything on a fast track. Um, so I'm not sure how much it's benefited. It hasn't really benefited me much, but I'm sure it's benefited other people. I feel like most of the stuff that I've worked on has been high priority, or I've known strategically what legal language to use or what documents. I've done enough pre-reporting on my request where I didn't need that. Like, you know, what you're fighting against is the public records custodians' time and priorities. If you make the job, I don't want to say easier for them, but if you make your request manageable, they will find that as something that they can kind of push through quickly. And so you naturally increase your chance of becoming a priority versus the news cycle. I don't know if they particularly care that you're you're on news deadline, but they would care if you made their job easier.
Got it. That's great. That's great. Last thing, Kimbrielle, just leave us with one piece of encouragement for the work that for everything that you've talked about in terms of like fighting for your request, fighting for the fees to get reduced. Just one inspirational.
I would say find what makes it fun for you because this is hard work. It's work. You're going to run up against obstacles. You're going to have public records custodians talking about you. They will take, and so you just have to find something that makes it enjoyable. For me, I made a game out of everything. How quickly can I get through my FOIA Friday calls? Can I get through all of them in 10 minutes? Can I, get this FOIA request, the first request, which I've done with federal agencies a couple of times, and so you just have to find ways to strategize. And every time you strategize, you become better at it. And then my last thing would be is when you become better at it, pay it forward and share with other people like who are doing this kind of work, similar to what we're doing today.
No, that's awesome. Well, I can't thank you enough. This has been such a informative session with you. Kimbrielle's put together an awesome tip sheet for getting your FOIA fees reduced. We're going to post that on the FIJ website. Like I said, everyone who's registered, you're going to get an email from FIJ sometime in the next week with a link to the recording of this webinar and the tip sheet. Just a few important reminders. Again, September 24th is the deadline for regular grant proposals and seed grant proposals. Tons of information. Email us if you have questions. Honestly, we want to help you get this money to do this work. We really, really want to help you as much as possible. The Alicia Patterson Fellowships, the deadline is October 1st, and you'll be hearing from us about an upcoming webinar about what makes a good Alicia Patterson application. If you have any questions about applying, you want to make a suggestion for a webinar, you can email us at grants@fij.org. Again, tons of resources on the website. We've heard from former grantees that that's where they began and how helpful it was. So again, our job is to help you get a grant. Thank you all for joining us. Kimbrielle, you're awesome. Thank you so much and have a
Thank you.
wonderful rest of your week. Take care, everyone.
Take
Bye-bye.
care, everyone.